Let me ask you a question. Let's say you're tasked with designing a team-based PvP game. How would you go about differentiating the teams? Would you create team uniforms and colors to achieve this? What about outlining teams in different colors instead of changing their outfit colors? Or would you have teams simply wearing different clothes depending on which side they're on? When answering this question, I think the first thing you should think about is what would fit the art style we're going with. Different games not only require different information to be conveyed, but the visual style the game adopts can force them into some limited ways. Today, we'll be looking at how 3 different FPS games handle differentiating teams and players: TF2, Overwatch, and Csgo. The reason I've chosen these games are not just because of my familiarity with TF2 and Overwatch, but because I wanted to show the difference in visual design choices between 2 hero shooters and one without any classes. I'd like to thank the people who helped me out with the CSGO information, since it's not a game I personally play. The CSGO portion would not have been done without you guys. When looking at these 3 games, it's probably pretty easy to tell what design choices were used to allow players to be able to identify which player belongs to which team. Let's start with TF2. TF2 is the only game in the bunch that has 2 completely consistent palettes between the teams. The use of red and blue teams means designers were allowed to design not just easily recognizable color palettes for the teams, but they were also able to use those warm and cool colors on the environment design as well. The color scheme created for both teams extends into the map design, as every building owned by each team corresponds with either the warm or cool color palette associated with the teams. But it doesn't just affect the colors used, it also affects the materials. Red's architecture leans more towards rustic, with a heavy use of brick and wood, while blue uses concrete and steel. These design choices allow for players to get an idea of which team's territory they're in. A red stepping into a building with blue and gray hues tells them they've stepped into enemy territory and are more likely to encounter an enemy more than they would if they were on their own side, spies not included. Overall, the visual design of TF2 had a lot of thought and effort put into it originally. Cosmetics and weapon skins aside, TF2 excels in its readability because specific team colors are used to distinguish teams. TF2 doesn't have to use any other techniques to make sure a player can immediately tell who belongs to what team. On the other hand, Overwatch specifically uses colored outlines. Because Overwatch doesn't have the advantage of 2 wholly distinct teams like TF2, it had to find another way of telling players who's on what team. Their solution, and what's probably the most popular choice for team differentiation in games today, are character outlines. Enemies are outlined with a relatively thick red outline, while teammates aren't at all. It doesn't matter what side you're on, the enemy will always be outlined in red. These outlines are also accompanied by red health bars that appear once you do damage to an enemy. While this works in theory, and a majority of the time, Overwatch has an underlying problem of extreme visual noise due to the amount of abilities with massive distracting flashes of color and particle effects. When a player is bombarded with visuals, it becomes difficult to not just tell what heroes are currently in the fight without glancing at the kill feed or scoreboard, but also who may be on the other team. This method works more in games with less visual noise like, ironically, TF2, despite the fact the game doesn't need it because of its existing choices. Meanwhile, Counter-Strike charts a bit of a middle ground between the two. Both teams do have different color palettes, though a lot less distinct than TF2, coupled with being less consistent due to being variable between maps. As you can see here, each map has a slightly different look to each side. Terrorist outfits range from some payday-looking dude to SpongeBob telling them to put money in the bag.
Put the money in the bag! Put it in!
The counter-terrorist side features special forces from multiple different nations with noticeably different headgear and palettes, ranging from the more saturated blue, green, and yellow of the FBI to the muted browns and greens of the IDF. This makes color recognition play a lot differently compared to TF2, but it does still exist, unlike in Overwatch. Now that's with the default appearances. Players can also set their own custom models with a pre-approved set for competitive, which can either help or hurt recognition depending on who you ask. CSGO also does a portion of what Overwatch does by including a small colored arrow over the heads of your teammates. This is to both recognize which team they're on as well as to tell between your own teammates. This recognition is especially important in CSGO as there's a tricky little thing called friendly fire. We don't exactly want anyone getting Stonewall Jackson here. Aside from players needing to be able to tell who belongs to what team, specifically hero class shooters, a player needs to be able to easily recognize which character is which so they know how to approach them. Obviously, CSGO doesn't necessarily fall into this requirement due to the fact it doesn't have a class system, but recognition is still a factor, so it will be talked about later. But let's start with the two games that actually need it. TF2, unlike Overwatch, has a much smaller roster size to work with and, likely because of that, excels in making characters recognizable. When cosmetics aren't in the mix. TF2 is famous for its incredibly well-designed character silhouettes, with both their design and animation working together to make sure players are instantly able to recognize a character even if they aren't able to see detail. However, aside from the unique design of everyone's silhouettes, TF2 uses a unique technique that makes sure characters don't blend into the backgrounds. No matter where a character is on a map, whether it's a well-lit area or a barely lit one, they will always be lit with a rim light. TF2 utilizes lighting in two very specific ways. One is ambient lighting, based on which team owns which area. Red-owned areas often utilize more natural lighting, having the sun light them or the light having just the smallest tint of yellow, making it feel more warm and natural. Blue, being a more industrial-styled company, has harsher fluorescent lighting that is often lit by artificial light as opposed to the naturalness of the sun. The second and more relevant to the topic at hand is the rim lighting. Rim lighting is simply lighting from a source positioned at an angle that provides lighting around the edges or rim of an entity. This creates an outline around either the person or object, or partial outlining depending on the position of the light and how many are used. This outline of sorts allows objects to pop out from the background and helps to distinguish them from the rest of the world. It's basically the same concept of a drop shadow from a visual design aspect. Its use in TF2 is primarily to reinforce the already strong silhouettes, as well as to indicate where one model ends and another begins. Overwatch is generally decent at character recognition, with a few exceptions I'll get into in a minute. Not only are characters themselves distinguishable, but in most cases you can recognize roles from the silhouettes even if you don't know the game that well. Tanks tend to be significantly bulkier in profile. Damage dealers typically have their weapons as a prominent portion of their profile, and healers are usually either slimmer or lower to the ground than other heroes. Except Torb, he's a small boy. Overwatch does, however, fall short in a couple aspects of this approach. Their designers struggled to distinguish between some of their female characters, and the variety of skins, some of which change these silhouettes, make color recognition unreliable, hence why using different team uniforms wasn't a viable option. In the heat of a battle, it can be difficult to distinguish between Widowmaker, Baby Diva, and Tracer, as their profiles aren't super different from one another. However, overall, Overwatch distinguishes their characters fairly well. CSGO is the outlier of this topic, as there is no difference between characters themselves outside of which team they're on, since the game doesn't utilize different classes. As such, they don't really have to differentiate between individuals on the opposing team. They do, however, have to use an outside indicator to show who's who on your own team, which they accomplish with the overhead arrow I mentioned earlier. As the game is inherently limited here based on both aesthetic and gameplay design, this is about the best solution they could really get. In addition to being able to recognize the team and individual characters, a player also needs to be able to assess how much of a threat a character is. Back on Overwatch, this is why tanks, DPS, and support are generally designed like I mentioned earlier. The DPS tend to have the most kill potential, so their weapons are a large part of their profile, with Echo being the biggest exception as she was confirmed by developers to originally have been a support. Tanks are designed as large heroes with an imposing stature, so the players are naturally drawn to look at them. Supports are supposed to be the least threatening, so they're designed to be either compact or skinny. Though this does run counter to the idea of them being the most important to kill first. However, these ideas aren't a hard and fast rule, and there are other niche cases of different methods even within Overwatch. Hammond, since his weapons aren't his main threat, has his mobility highlighted with the fireball effect, pretty clearly saying, "Don't touch me, I will run you over." The exact opposite can be seen with Zarya. Since she's the highest DPS tank, her weapon is huge and obvious, and the same can be said for Hog. They both go slightly against the style of the rest of their role, but the information that is conveyed about them is just as, if not more important, than just saying, "Me tank, me block things." Like Overwatch, TF2 also puts an emphasis on weapons, but due to the much smaller roster of characters, it was easier to design the base weapons for each class. Just like the character design, careful thought was put into the silhouette of each weapon as well as the color scheme. The character design follows a rule that states the colors of a merc's uniform have to highlight their torso. What this means is that as you look at a model from the feet up, the colors gradually get brighter and brighter. This is how the designers make sure a player's eyes look towards a merc's chest, which not only tells them the most information on which class they're fighting, but because weapons are also accompanied with rim lighting, it tells them what weapon they are wielding, as a majority of weapons are held around the torso area. This design choice essentially consolidates the information players need to be able to pick up in an instant. By having the eye drawn to the brightly colored torso, a player learns what class they're fighting, what team they're on, and what weapon they are currently firing at you. With the exception of Medic, who kinda forces your eye to his crotch with his dark belt, essentially segmenting the bright coat. Granted, that's where the eye should be going on him. Again, this entire design philosophy implemented by Valve is ignoring the state the game is in today. We're talking about the initial choices in design and not what a mess it has become with silhouette breaking hats and art style breaking colors. Csgo gets interesting here. The only threat assessment info that really needs to be conveyed is the weapon they're carrying and who's the bomb carrier. The bomb carrier is shown visually via the bomb being on their back, or being carried if the player chooses to have it out in place of a weapon. Weapons themselves get a lot trickier to spot, as you're left with silhouette, both weapon and player since they're held differently, and color. I'm mainly going to skip over color since the game has a huge variety of weapon skins, both official and custom, that change the aspect of the weapon. What this results in is being left to recognize weapons by silhouette and sound. This has to be done very quickly since fights in Counter-Strike tend to be over within 5 to 8 shots, or less if there's a headshot-friendly gun involved. This is where the game falls short in visual presentation. As while each gun does technically have a unique profile, they're similar enough, usually far away enough, and seen briefly enough to not be readily recognizable in-game. The last point I want to touch on here is how sound design is used to convey important information to players. Now this, in and of itself, is a topic that should be talked about on its own as there are a lot that encompasses sound design, but for this video, I'll be specifically talking about how it contributes to the recognizability of team alignment. Overwatch probably uses the most expansive sound design for this reason out of the 3 games here. Because abilities and ultimates are a core part of the gameplay, it's important to be able to not just denote when either are being used, but who's using it. The ults are the most important thing to hear, and the way Overwatch does this is by having distinctly different voice lines for friendly and enemy ults. Many heroes' enemy voice lines are spoken in their native language, as opposed to their friendly callouts.
Reality bends to my will. Yahi param vastavikta hai.
But even those that are said in the same language are made distinctly different from the friendly ones.
Clear the area.
Enemy ult voice lines are generally more aggressive said and louder, to signify to you that it's not a friendly ult being popped. In a sense, the sound design is what Overwatch excels in. Have you ever tried to play Overwatch muted, or with certain sounds missing? I know I have, and it's a horrible experience.
I'm swapping out the Monkey, got monkey.
I'm not on
Soldier's still on top right.
Not being able to hear things like a wrecking ball about to slam, or a Sombra hacking, or a Doomfist charging rocket punch actively hurts your game and can cause you to lose. The main goal of the sound design for Overwatch is to be able to relay important information without needing a visual cue, and what it excels in: when it works. However, just like its visuals, Overwatch does still have a problem with cluttering up the sounds it plays. Voice lines and sounds can overlap, making it difficult to tell exactly what got used, and for some, it becomes extremely hard to pick out important information. It's basically the same as cluttered comms during a competitive match. On the other hand, TF2 doesn't exactly do much in the sound design department to distinguish between teams. Instead, it more so has a focus on weapon sounds for identification purposes. While Overwatch uses distinct footsteps for each hero, TF2 uses weapons. The sound effects of firing weapons are all easily identifiable as to what weapon it is, which in turn tells you generally what class is around the bend. Granted, there are exceptions with multi-class weapons like the shotgun, but those remain secondary choices for a reason. The exception here is Engineer, as a shotgun is his primary weapon, but the shotgun is not what players have to be able to identify for him. Instead, it's the sentry gun. Even the Engineer's sentry gun has sounds unique to each level that tell a player which level a gun is that isn't in their line of sight. Audio is where a bulk of the Csgo's information is conveyed. It uses footsteps in a similar style to Overwatch, but with good enough audio balance to make it effective. Every gun has a unique sound and fire rate, making it easy to differentiate by audio cues alone. As a specific example, some of the most popular guns have completely unique sound effects and patterns. You have the reverberating percussive AK, the more restrained M4, and the almost excessively loud AWP. Even the grenades have different sounds between teams. You hear breaking glass and flames? Terroricide through a Molotov. Flames without glass? Counter-terrorist incendiary. As a rule, audio is more important side of information gathering in Counter-Strike as opposed to visuals. So I guess the main question people may be asking is, which game does it the best? The answer to that is, does it matter? Each game is its own strong, independent game that doesn't need no comparison. Even if I just spent the entire video essentially doing just that. What each game needs to convey to the player is different due to their gameplay, art style, and design choices that determine how they can do it. If I had to choose one though, I'd say TF2 does it the best, but a lot of that is due to how little information it needs to show as opposed to Overwatch. Unlike Csgo, its more goofy art style allows it to make the team uniforms contrast each other more, as it can get away with brighter colors. Csgo's limitation of its realism doesn't allow such a thing, but it works with what it has and still manages to convey what it needs to the players. Each game shines in one area over the others aside from Overwatch, which is basically a jack of all trades and master of none. TF2 excels in the visual design aspect with the team color palettes and silhouettes, making it incredibly easy to identify not just team alignment, but also class choice. Csgo wins in the sound department design, which makes relative sense due to its more realistic approach in gameplay and design. The takeaway here is that there are many different ways for developers to differentiate teams and characters. What they choose to do is based on how the overall design of the game is being developed towards and what fits that style. There's no one solid great choice. The only thing that matters is what works for that game.